Welcome back, teachers. As we continue today towards our end goal of the learning target, I can write a behavioral learning objective. We want to remember and keep in mind that there will be multiple learning targets that we have to achieve on the way towards this goal. So as you remember, in our last class, we combated the myth that effective teachers are just naturally good teachers. And we talked about the need for careful and strategic planning before the teacher steps into the classroom, so that the teacher steps into the classroom with a specific learning target in mind. The effective teacher knows that he or she or they will be working towards the specific measurable objective the entire class time. And so everything that teacher does inside the classroom, the lectures or the activities or the assessment, is all centered around achieving that learning target. Now, we also talked about how all of our lessons, we're going to design those using backward instruction design. We're starting with the standard, with our goal that's already been prescribed to us by the state or by whatever the current system is. So you'll have your list, and I asked you to pick those out with your teams in our last class, so you have those already prescribed. And so as a teacher, you have to map out your plan, which one you're going to work on in which order, and then as you get each one, you'll notice that each individual learning target, learning state standard, may or may not be achievable in one class period. So we need to break that down. We need to what we call unwrap. So in our last class, you met with your teaching team, your professional learning community briefly, and each community picked out a standard that you would use to unwrap in this class. Now, I also asked you before this class to go ahead and find a copy online or a diagram online of Norman Webb's DOK, Depth of Knowledge. That's going to come in handy as we work through and as we unwrap these standards in our goal to getting towards writing a learning objective. So before you meet with your team today to work on unwrapping those standards, I want to walk you through the process as a whole class. So feel free to take some notes. I'll also be leading you and your teams through this step by step, but feel free to write down some notes so that you come into your professional learning community more prepared. I also want to say, before we divide up, and remind you that these professional learning communities and these teacher teams, this is a real world scenario. When you get into your classroom, when you get your first job, you're not going to be alone. There's going to be someone else in your building, across the hall, or maybe in your district who teaches the same class that you teach. And you're going to be expected to partner with that fellow teacher as you work through the standards and as you map out your curriculum. And in doing so, this collaboration, the sharing of ideas, is going to produce a better result for your students. So as we work through this process in the next couple classes together, just realize this is a skill that you're going to get to repeat and enjoy and become more familiar with and more comfortable with as you move throughout your professional career. So the first thing that you'll have to do in order to unwrap, when I say unwrap the standard, I'm talking about deconstructing it. Now remember, the visual that I like to think about when we're talking about achieving this standard for your students, think about the ladder. And I didn't come up with this visualization example. This comes from Kim Bailey and Chris Jacksonick Make It Happen book. And so I just love the way that they describe achieving the state standard as a ladder. And at the very top, rung of the ladder. That's the state standard. But before you get to that state standard, you have to climb this step and this learning target. And then your students, once they master that, they can reach this smaller learning target that builds on this one and may have a higher depth of knowledge. And then they move up the rung to this step. And so as we're unpacking the state standard, we're essentially breaking it down into easier, smaller steps that your students have to master one by one in order to reach the top. And so don't become frustrated if the standard that your team selected seems really big and bulky. As we unwrap it and unpack it and analyze it today during class, you're going to see how it naturally sorts itself out into those smaller, measurable, more digestible steps. So the first thing you're going to do inside your team, but also individually, you're going to have to write out that standard. It may seem long and it may take more than a minute to get it all typed out or written out on your paper, but this is something that you have to do in order to be able to unwrap it. Because as you can see, the next step is going to rely on marking that standard up. And so let me go ahead and describe. The next step is an annotation exercise. If we can mark up the standard, if we can diagram it out visually, I think that when you talk about it within your team, you'll feel more comfortable because you'll see it in its distinct and separate parts. So the 3 ways that I want you to mark up your standard, first I want you to use brackets. These are just your simple brackets, and I want you to go through your standard and I want you to put brackets around anything that gives you context to that standard. So does the standard specify a specific type of text? Are we dealing with fiction or are we dealing with nonfiction? Maybe there's a type of problem mentioned in your standard. Go ahead and put brackets around that. Maybe your standard asks the student to do or perform a certain task. Let's put brackets around that. So the first thing we're going to do when we break up into our teams, and you might be able to get started on that as I'm walking you through it right now, is we're going to put brackets around the context information within the standard that we've copied out. Everyone in your group will have the same standard, but you may notice that different pieces of context stand out to different team members, and that's the beauty of collaborating within our professional learning communities that we have inside of this class. The second thing I want you to do on those standards, I want you to take your pen or your highlighter or your marker, and I want you to circle all the verbs. So go line by line, word by word, identify the verbs by circling them. We want those verbs to stand out because those verbs are giving us a little insight into the skills that might be needed to accomplish that standard. And so those are going to be keywords for us, and we really want those to pop when we look down at our standards. The last thing you're going to do, after you've used brackets for your context information, you've circled those verbs, I want you to underline all of your significant nouns. Some of these nouns may even be found inside of those brackets, and that's okay. But we want to just underline, emphasize those nouns, those concepts, those ideas that stand out inside of your standards. Now that you've marked up your standards within your group, we'll take a few minutes and we'll share those annotations. And maybe as you're sharing your annotations, you're thinking about a story that would qualify for that type of text, or you're thinking about an exercise that a teacher conducted with a class that you were in one time or that you witnessed that was particularly effective. And so these are just natural conversations that will begin to happen as we talk about the things that we've circled, the verbs that we've circled, and the nouns that we've underlined, and the context that we've bracketed inside those standards. Next, we're going to try to use a graphic organizer to make this information make sense for us as we're breaking it down into smaller learning targets. Now, I resisted the urge to give you a graphic organizer because I know as teachers, graphic organizers are your best friend, and some of you prefer, straight up and down charts. Some of you like the circle bubble displays, and so I have not given one to you. I'm going to let you create your own. And so as a group, I want one group graphic organizer as our end result for this class period. So you can talk to your group and decide what visualization strategy makes the most sense for your learning target or is the most fun and enjoyable to use today. Within your graphic organizers, what we're going to be looking to identify, we want to identify things that the students will have to know and understand. That's our first category. What does the student, based on this standard, need to know and understand? Secondly, we also want to identify what will the students have to do or demonstrate in order to achieve this standard. What will the students have to do or demonstrate to achieve this standard? And finally, we want to identify any new academic language or vocabulary that the students are going to have to absorb as they learn this standard and as they master it. What are these new terms that they're going to have to come home verbalizing and really just, I've been amazed. As a parent on the other side of the classroom, I've been amazed at the terms that I hear my children come home and say when I ask them, what did you do in school today? And so some of the vocabulary that their teachers are showing them and building into the lessons just amazes me that a second grader and a fourth grader can talk about, these complex terms and verbalize exactly what they mean. Not only can my second grader and my fourth grader verbalize new academic vocabulary that their teacher has intentionally used inside the classroom and required her students to verbalize back to her or him, but they can also verbalize the learning target. And so like we talked about last time, it's not enough for you as the instructor to know what the goal is for the student, what the learning objective is. The student has to know the learning objective. The student has to be able to say, I can write a learning objective, or I can count to 100 by fives. And so another great strategy, and depending on your school and your principal, you may have to have that learning target written on the board. But if you're teaching a lower level elementary class, you will have to repeat that learning target over and over as the students are accomplishing it to remind them what they are accomplishing. We talked about the ladder, and we talked about how we're going to get to the end result by accomplishing these small learning targets in sequence. And so last week you worked on recognizing the role of the behavior learning objective as far as guiding the teacher towards being effective in getting the student results on assessments and accomplishing what the school system mandates for that classroom. So today, our learning objective is simply, I can deconstruct the standard. I can deconstruct the standard. And so we've already talked about how inside your group, you'll be going through and you'll be annotating by bracketing those context words, and you'll be circling the verbs, and you'll be underlining those significant nouns, and then you'll be using a graphic organizer to classify what students will need to know, and those could be multiple things because these learning targets, sometimes these standards have multiple learning targets built inside of them, which is why it's not feasible or advisable to try to accomplish an entire standard in one lesson. We break them down. And then you'll also have the do and demonstrate category on your graphic organizer, and then you'll have the academic vocabulary so that when I come around to see your group progress, I can see these divisions, these deconstructions of the state standard. Then, the last thing, and I think we're going to have to save this for next week, I don't think we'll have time today, but the last part of unwrapping a standard is understanding the rigor associated with that standard. Now remember, for homework, you were supposed to find a chart, an organizer, or just the words written out that describe the levels of knowledge, the 4 levels of knowledge that Webb developed, and what's involved in each one. so each one of his levels of knowledge get more difficult and more complex and longer lasting and produce more complex end results. And they also have words associated with them that will help you as you are deconstructing these standards into smaller learning targets. They have these academic vocabulary words and these verbs that will especially help you as you go through and map those out for your students. So I'm going to break you up, but I want you to know, if you get past the graphic organizer, go ahead as a group, as a learning community, as a teaching team, go ahead and pull out Webb's levels, Webb's DOK levels of knowledge, depth of knowledge, and go ahead and start working through those and try to decide what levels different parts of your standards hit, because that's going to be where we're headed, and I don't want you as a group to be bored or feel like you can't move forward in your task. I really enjoyed describing this to you. You're not alone. As you begin working in your teams, I'll be walking around, and I'll also help pace you as a class. And I might even throw some of my notes up on the board so that you can see, if you get stuck, what your next step is going to be. So remember, we're working towards the end learning objective of I can write a learning objective. And so let's go ahead and break up in our groups, and let me know as I'm walking around if you have any questions. Love to answer those. Thank you.